Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We're here for Music in Global America, and we're going to be talking once again about old world transplants and revivals. This time, we're going to turn our attention to Irish music, Irish folk music, and all sorts of intersections of Irish music with other musical genres. As always, I have prepared some lecture notes for today, so let me go ahead and toggle over those or over to those so that you can see what I'm talking about for today. So, like I said, Irish music is going to be our focal point. And in order to give us a little bit of context for talking about Irish music, we need to talk about Irish immigration, Irish Americans, and sort of the history of movement that has happened for the Irish people. So let me go ahead and start off with over here in our left-hand corner. So approximately 34.5 million Americans, which is more than 10% of the population, are of Irish ancestry. This compares with the population of Ireland itself, which is about 5 million people. I guess it's actually just a little bit more than 5 million. The global Irish diaspora is about 10 times the population of Ireland and concentrated in the US, Canada, England, and Australia. So those are our main areas where we're going to be thinking and listening, or thinking about the music of and listening to. So, of course, originally coming from Ireland, the first wave of immigrants really arrived in North America in the 18th century. In between 1717 and 1770 alone, we had 250,000 Irish immigrate to North America. Most of them were Presbyterian Scottish planters who had arrived from Ireland and had lived there for several generations. Finding that land in Ireland was scarce and expensive or rather, finding that land that was scarce and inexpensive on the coast of the United States, a number of them settled somewhat closer inland in Pennsylvania, and then later in the hills of Virginia and Carolina. So those were also popular landing places for German and English immigrants as well. Later, settled in further to Tennessee, Kentucky, and Texas. So we also have a second wave of Irish immigration that happens significantly later, 1820 to 1860. And that move was a huge amount of the Irish population. About a third of all immigrants in the United States were from Ireland at that time. And of that group, interestingly enough, single women constituted the largest portion of Irish immigrants. Most of these immigrants at this time were poor Catholics, and they were from rural areas. And it's estimated that about 1.25 million Irish ended up immigrating during the Great Famine alone, and that stretched from 1844 to 1852. And most of those individuals came to the United States. Of course, we're going to talk about the immigration acts that the U.S. enacted, but there were huge points of propaganda very specifically aimed against Irish immigrants specifically, and it's no wonder they were one of the largest groups that were coming over. They ended up settling in cities for the most part in the 18th and 19th centuries, specifically New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. So our first wave of Irish immigration was a little bit more rural based, not so much on the coast of the US, but slightly more inland, versus our second wave of immigration, which is significantly more based in metropolitan areas, big cities, industrial centers. Irish immigration ended up declining, of course, as I mentioned, in the 1920s because there were some really ruthless anti-immigration laws passed during the Great Depression of the 1930s. Economic recessions of the 1950s and 70s in Ireland led to an estimated about 600,000 Irish immigrants, mostly men in this case, coming to seek work in England. So we've had an interesting mobile trajectory over a number of different centuries and decades therein. So immigration ended up thinking more currently. Immigration rose substantially in 2008 during the collapse of the banking industry. So most of the immigrants in this last sort of great poll have been young, highly educated, and mostly bound for England, Australia, and Europe. So very, very interesting patterns of movement that we have seen. So this gives us a little bit of a context for thinking about the actual traditional music and folk music of Ireland. So traditional music of Ireland, we're moving on to this lower left-hand part here. Traditional music of Ireland usually refers to the repertoire of anonymous dance music that's usually passed down orally that was started to be accumulated in the 18th century. Much of this repertoire is also preserved by music collectors who transcribed the music that was played for them by the instrumentalists. But again, this is a musical tradition that is passed down orally from generation to generation. As a result, we're going to see that that way of disseminating remembered ideas is going to have a relationship in a large part to form and structure in a piece of music. So the tradition, like I said, because it's passed down, it's a living tradition. A musician today might know hundreds of tunes by memory, but they also know newly created tunes that are in circulation that have kind of some shared vocabulary. In this case, the term traditional, though, is commonly meant to refer to the instrumental body of music, while vocal and dance music traditions of Ireland are mostly considered folk cultures. So we're going to have some intersection here between music and folk, especially because there's a strong tie between Irish music and Irish dance. It wasn't until the 20th century that traditional Irish music was, or until the 20th century rather, traditional Irish music was really played by a soloist. Ensemble playing is somewhat more of a modern development. We also saw that same trend with klezmer music, which is interesting to note. So traditional music has been closely associated with the rural poor, Irish music, Irish folk music. It's the greater part of the Irish population for whom it has been their major cultural resource. So more so than any other sort of artistic outlet, we're going to see that the Irish identify very, very strongly with music and dance and the combination of the two together. At the end of the 19th century, and we saw this with klezmer music as well, recording and broadcasting technology have huge impacts on the transmission of music. So Irish music and Irish dance became emblems of Ireland through this dissemination process and helped really spark a global fascination with Irish culture, which was very interesting. Today, it's only really increased the emergence of transmission because we have, we are further imbued with different cultures just with our rise of technology and ability to do so. But today there are even, you know, of course, revivals of old styles, and old styles that are met with sort of modern styles to create interesting fusions and combinations of different genres of music, which we'll cover towards the end, part 4 of lecture today. Irish music and Irish dance song traditions over here. There are some traditional musical instruments that we're going to want to be on the lookout for. They're over here on the lower left-hand side. We're going to be listening out to the fiddle, otherwise known as a violin. The difference between a fiddle and a violin is a point of a whole bunch of argument. It mostly comes down to not the actual construction of the instrument itself, however, the way in which it's played. So typically a fiddler plays in a somewhat more percussive manner versus a violin, which is an instrument that can be a little bit more melodic, perhaps. We're also going to hear a lot of these bagpipes that are also called the unison bagpipes. They're the national bagpipes of Ireland. They are really interesting to see. Actually, before we even talk about the bagpipes, I'd love to play for us an example of some Irish fiddling. And very specifically, we're going to listen to what's called 2 different reels on a fiddle. And as you can see down here, a reel is a kind of Irish dance. So this music, if it seems to move you, is because indeed it is meant to accompany a dance. So let me go ahead and pause my talking and pull up a musical example for us to listen to. We will check out some Irish fiddling. So as you can tell, we've mostly been alternating between 2 different ideas, which is something we will cover in our discussion of form in a little bit. But let's go through some other instruments that we encounter in the context of Irish music. I got a little bit ahead of myself. I wanted to talk about the national bagpipes of Ireland. The Uilleann pipes, otherwise known as the unison pipes, they are, interestingly enough, controlled by bellows that are operated by the elbow rather than the breath. As a result, you play the instrument while seated. So it's going to have a very similar timbre to perhaps Scottish bagpipes that you have heard in the past, but they are a bit different. So it's a slightly smaller instrument. It has a little bit of a sweeter sound that has a little bit more nuance to it than its Scottish cousin. So why don't I go ahead and pull up an example of a jig, again, a dance form um, that really showcases those unison pipes. Give me one moment. Love that. So really, again, an instrument that is capable of a little bit more nuance and a little bit more dynamicism in terms of the different timbres that we're hearing. A little less abrasive, to put it in different words than the Scottish bagpipe that we, I think, are a little bit more familiar with. In any case, there are a couple of other instruments that I want to make sure that we mention in regard to Irish music. The next one up that I want to discuss is the button accordion. And the button accordion and the accordion in general are instruments that are used in both of the Old World revivals that klezmer music and Irish music. And the button accordion was a really popular music or a popular instrument rather, for traditional music in the late 19th century. It has a very versatile role within an ensemble because of its ability to play both accompaniment, multiple notes at a time, and also melody. So in doing so, it can very easily replicate a lot of these traditional tunes that we're listening to in a solo context. So I've got an example of two reels. Again, we're going to talk about reels shortly when we talk about Irish dances, but it's going to be very similar to our first example that we listened to, the interchange of these two different ideas. So let me go ahead and pull up our example of a button accordion. Wonderful. So uh, we had three fiddlers and a button accordion in that context, where the accordion was also playing alongside the melody in addition to filling out the accompanimental role. Again, a diverse instrument, I mean, perhaps smaller than some of the other accordions you may have seen in the past, but something that's going to appear a number of times in the musical examples that we'll cover for the rest of our lecture today. Going back to my lecture notes, talking about one other instrument here, and that's the wooden flutes and tin whistles. Part of the reason why they make an appearance, in addition to the other instruments that we've seen, is the high portability factor of them. So, you know, the wooden flutes showed up in the sort of mid 1800s, and metal flutes were being developed elsewhere. Tin whistles became really popular when we started favoring metallic designs, but they were easily mass produced. They could also be homemade, so they were very easy to play. The construction of them, you know, maybe as a kid you had a recorder. A recorder, it has a very similar construction to some of the instruments that we will see here shortly in our example that has Irish flutes and tin whistles. I will go ahead and pull that up real quick. So as you can tell, just like the other examples that we listened to, this is the interchange of two different ideas, reels. We're going to talk about dance forms in part 2. But notice that the wooden flute and the fiddle are playing the exact same part together, but they're ornamenting it. They're adding decorations to it that are a little bit different, that create a little bit of perhaps blurriness to the music. It sounds almost like the two instruments together create an almost bagpipe-like sound. One of the reasons why bagpipe ends up being a really good blend with these two instruments is how the musical material is actually being used for the particular timbres of the instruments. So this is a wooden flute. There's also a metal flute, a tin whistle, that's often used in Irish music. Would love to show you an example of that. She is so fierce on that instrument. What's awesome is that we have two flutes that have essentially a very similar kind of construction to them, but they're made out of totally two different materials. Wood and metal have two totally different timbres, which is very interesting to hear in different combinations with different instruments. So to just wrap up our first section and talk about a couple of other instruments that do make an appearance in traditional Irish music, Irish folk music, I want to play again two reels, and I'll finally discuss what a reel is in part 2 when we talk about dance music, that actually have a dulcimer in the mix to try to tie us back with our tradition of klezmer music, because again, these old world transplants certainly have something to do with one another. So let me pull up our last listening example for part 1. So really fun. Again, everything that we've heard is incredibly upbeat, has a lot of movement and momentum to it. And part of that is because of how often music is tied to the tradition of dance when it comes to Irish music and Irish folk music. So when we come back for part 2, we're going to talk about all of the different forms that these tunes take, the actual Irish dances, and also talk about Irish songs as well, ballads and the like. So I will see you back for part 2 shortly.